The storm had begun like any other in late spring, with low rumbles, trembling leaves, and the slow heave of dark clouds clawing their way over the Missouri hills. But by midnight, the sky above Gilead had split open. The lightning struck not with fury, but with precision, as if it had a memory, and the wind wailed with the desperation of something old and buried. At the center of the town stood St. Erasmus Parish, tall and proud, its steeple piercing the heavens like a sword made of brick and prayer. Inside its tower, the bells hung silent as they had for years, their ropes decayed and forgotten. Yet at the hour the tower cracked and groaned and finally collapsed in on itself like a kneeling man struck down by unseen guilt. The bells rang, not once, not twice, but again and again, chiming as the stones buckled, the wood shattered, and the cross at the peak was swallowed in dust. Witnesses said they heard no thunder in that moment, only the deep, aching toll of the church bells rising and falling like breath. And even when the tower was gone and the night fell silent, they swore the ringing continued for several minutes beneath the earth. By dawn, the townspeople had gathered around the ruin, unsure whether to mourn or marvel. Some crossed themselves, others wept, but none entered. It wasn't until the mayor ordered the debris cleared, hoping to rebuild the landmark by harvest, that the unease turned to dread. Beneath the rubble, where the foundation should have been, was a hidden stair, narrow, carved into stone not native to the area, and sealed with a rusted iron hatch covered in strange white residue that wasn't lime and wasn't mold. It took 3 men and a crowbar to lift it. The air that escaped was heavy, ancient, and wrong, like opening the mouth of a grave that had never seen daylight. At first, they thought it was a forgotten wine cellar or crypt, but what they found was no place to rest. The chamber stretched outward like a rib cage beneath the sanctuary floor, the walls lined with decayed wood slats and tarnished hooks. There were no religious markings, no crosses, no icons. Only a single iron chair bolted into the center of the floor with leather restraints frayed by age but still intact. Dust revealed shapes that shouldn't have been there, worn grooves in the stone that resembled footprints, yet no one had walked those halls in decades. The smell was not rot, but something metallic and stale, as if fear itself had been bottled and left to ferment. A second, smaller door stood at the end of the chamber, sealed by a metal bar twisted shut like it had been done in panic, not design. When they forced it open, what lay beyond it would never be spoken of in the town's official history. The room had no floor. Only earth dug several feet deep, with bones partially embedded in the clay, not arranged, not buried, dropped, like waste, small bones, some no larger than a crow's wing. Others are clearly human, with signs of cutting too clean to be accidental. Someone had been down there not once but many times. Someone who had a method, someone who had a purpose that no scripture could justify. An old man among the crowd, one who had once served as an altar boy in his youth, collapsed when he saw the walls. For faintly, almost playfully scratched into the surface, were shapes that resembled musical bars, but they were irregular, distorted, and broken by symbols that looked more like wounds than notes. He whispered that they were not music but instructions, a sequence for ringing bells, a ritual. As others fled or crossed themselves harder, he muttered that the bells were never rung for God but for something beneath, something that listened. The town council closed the site by evening, ordering it filled with gravel and sealed under cement. But word spread quickly. Newspapers called it a structural failure. The clergy called it a tragedy. But those who lived nearest to the ruins refused to sleep for weeks, claiming the ringing still came at night, faint, echoing from underground. And those who had stood near the hatch the longest, those who had looked into the chamber too deeply, began to suffer nosebleeds, tremors, and vivid dreams. In one of those dreams, a man with no eyes and a mouth sewn shut sat in the iron chair and pointed upward, not at heaven but toward the bell tower that no longer stood. His hand bled down his wrist, dripping in time with a soundless hymn no one had ever sung aloud. And so the bells rang even after the tower fell, not because they hung on ropes, but because something far older than rope had once commanded them. Something that was never exercised, only buried. And now that it had been uncovered, the air in Gilead carried a weight that even wind could not move. They arrived in wagons cloaked in dust and hymns, 23 boys in all, none older than 13, each dressed in patched coats too thin for Missouri's coming winters. Their faces were blank, clean and drained of the mischief that should have flickered in boys their age. In 1838, the town of Gilead welcomed them as a blessing, a gift delivered by the new parish priest, Father Alphonse Miraut, recently transferred from a Boston seminary under quiet circumstances no one questioned too closely. He introduced the children as wards of the church, rescued from urban rot, destined to serve God in purity and voice. That year, St. Erasmus Parish was filled with the sound of choral music unlike anything the region had ever heard. The boys sang in perfect harmony, eyes lowered, hands folded, their voices high and unbroken. Always unbroken. Townspeople whispered that their songs could cleanse a soul, that they'd heard angels descend through the nave when the boys opened their mouths. But no one noticed that none of the boys ever grew taller. Their hair never darkened, their features never sharpened. They remained trapped in the same moment of boyhood, as though time passed around them, not through them. Father Alphonse kept them secluded in the rectory, claiming their spirits needed protection from sin. The doors remained locked, the curtains drawn. He spoke of routine fasts, midnight prayers, and divine silence. The boys rarely spoke outside of song. When addressed directly, they would lower their heads and wait for the Father's approval before answering. A few locals who offered them sweets or whispered jokes in the marketplace were met with stiff, rehearsed smiles and glassy stares. Their laughter, if it came, was brief and hollow, like something remembered rather than felt. Visitors to the rectory were turned away with courtesy laced in steel. Alphonse explained that discipline was paramount. "They are instruments, not children," he once said during a town sermon. "God requires perfect tone." No one questioned him. He walked with grace, offered food to the poor, and never raised his voice. He wrote poetry, visited the sick, and blessed each home before the spring thaw. But at night, through the cold stone walls of the church, some claimed to hear muffled cries wrapped in hymns, like pain carried on the wings of praise. When asked about the boys' origins, Father Alphonse would name cities, Baltimore, Boston, New Haven, but offered no surnames, no documentation. He claimed their pasts were stained and unworthy of remembrance. They were reborn in Gilead, purified through song. He often referred to his choir as the voiceless made audible, a phrase that unsettled those who thought about it too long. In 1840, a traveling doctor from St. Louis offered to examine the boys after noticing one of them walking with unnatural stiffness. Alphonse declined firmly, stating their health was a matter of divine concern, not medical intrusion. The doctor never returned. Neither did the boy. As the seasons passed, the choir's fame grew. People traveled from counties away to hear them perform, and each concert ended with donations poured into velvet-lined baskets. But none of the boys ever stepped off the church grounds unaccompanied. No one ever witnessed a birthday, a voice cracking, or a child leaving the parish to start life elsewhere. It became an unspoken truth in Gilead, something everyone chose not to notice. And beneath the flawless hymns, there was a pattern emerging. Each performance followed a precise mathematical structure, too rigid to be human. Some began to suspect the songs weren't just for God. They were for something else. Something that required silence between notes as much as it did the music itself. And still the boys sang, always in perfect unison, always the same faces, always the same height. Beneath the scorched floorboards of the rectory, inside a rotted chest sealed with pitch and wire, the ledger was found wrapped in cloth that crumbled to the touch. Its cover bore no title, only a symbol, a stitched circle drawn in faded red ink. Inside, the pages were brittle but intact, filled edge to edge in Father Alphonse's hand. The entries were methodical, dated, and sickeningly exact. Each line began with initials, some clearly belonging to the orphaned choir boys, others unknown, followed by measurements not of clothing or age, but of pain. One entry described RL, vocal strain reset, note E held beyond threshold, and a prescribed throat binding at 3-minute intervals. Another noted MJ, infraction of gaze, initiate ocular clarity test via saline injection behind lid. Each punishment was cross-referenced to a diagram, and each diagram was sketched with unsettling detail, flesh, muscle, bone, labeled not in Latin but in musical terms, clef, rest, crescendo. It became clear that Father Alphonse saw the boys not as souls, but as instruments to be tuned, corrected, and hollowed. His theology wasn't rooted in compassion or salvation, it was built on control, on the belief that suffering removed static from the divine frequency. He did not punish sin, he was punished for dissonance. Behind the collapsed eastern wall of the rectory, hidden behind a plastered-over doorway, they found the locked room. The door itself had been sealed from the inside with 4 rusted bolts. When forced open, the smell was immediate, thick, chemical, metallic, a stench that clung to the lungs. The room was small and square, with no windows and no light fixtures, only iron hooks in the ceiling and a drain carved into the center of the floor. Against the back wall stood a cabinet filled with tools, not one of which belonged in any carpenter's workshop. There were clamps curved for mouths, wire loops etched with tuning notches, calipers for measuring inner cartilage, and long, thin rods labeled in ink, tongue, ear, and spine. A set of pliers was modified with a small spike built into its hinge, designed not to break bone but to apply unbearable pressure without damage. None of these tools were rusted. They had been cleaned, oiled, and arranged with care. On the far wall, words were carved in shallow script, barely legible. Each note must bleed before it sings true. Pinned beside the tools was a sheet of parchment with a crude scale where each note on the musical staff corresponded to a different body part. A low C was marked souls, while a high G was marked optic nerve. Someone had taken the time to determine which nerves produced which pitches when struck and how long the sound would last before it turned to screaming. This was not music. This was experimentation. Ritualized mutilation shaped into theology. Every corner of the room spoke of patience, calculation, and the belief that agony could be perfected. As investigators stood in the doorway, too stunned to step inside, a small trickle of dark water leaked from the drain and pooled at their feet. It smelt faintly of rust and wax. One officer whispered that he thought he heard a ringing sound, not bells, but something smaller, like a fork struck gently against bone. The man could barely speak when they brought him to the ruins, his body brittle from age and tremors, but his eyes sharpened the moment he saw the scorched stones of the collapsed church. He hadn't stepped foot near St. Erasmus Parish in over 70 years, not since the day he ran. His name was Elias Hartwell, and when he was 9 years old, he had sung in the choir that Gilead called divine. They had all worn white robes with red sashes, except for one, a boy who wore no robe at all, the one with the blue rope. His name was Jonah, though Elias wasn't sure if that was his real name or the one given to him after his voice cracked too early. The rope had been tied around Jonah's waist like a belt, then knotted again at his throat, trailing upward into the shadows of the belfry. Elias remembered standing just beneath the bell loft, holding a hymnal that shook in his small hands while Jonah stood barefoot on the upper beam, trembling, eyes swollen, lips cracked. Father Alphonse called it a vertical penance, meant to stretch the spirit upward, closer to God. But Elias knew it was punishment for disobedience, for refusing to sing after a certain lesson. The blue rope wasn't tied to save him. It was tied to silence in a place no one could hear. The ritual always took place during storms. That way the thunder and bells could cloak anything. The children were told it was necessary to shield the congregation from unworthy sound. But Elias remembered the bells ringing in a frantic rhythm, not sacred, not ordered, like someone flailing against a cage made of metal and sky. On that night, lightning had struck close enough to light Jonah's face in one white flash. And what Elias saw wasn't a boy seeking forgiveness. It was a child too afraid to cry, hanging between heaven and horror, the rope tightening every time the wind pulled. The priest said they must not look up, only sing louder, that salvation was for the obedient, not the curious. But Elias had looked. He saw Jonah jerk once, twice, then go still, his mouth open in a silent gasp as the bells rang louder, faster, never pausing. No one tried to bring him down, and when the morning came, the rope was gone, so was Jonah. Now, decades later, Elias stood where the tower once rose and whispered that the bells had never been rung to summon God. They were rung to bury sound, to drown out the truth before it could echo. He said Father Alphonse believed that each scream, if timed with a bell's toll, could feed something in the silence between chimes, something ancient and hungry. Elias had run that night barefoot through mud and scripture and never looked back. But the sound followed him. Not in memory, but in nightmares, always beginning with a boy on a beam wrapped in blue and ending in a bell that rang long after no one was left to pull it. Father Alphonse did not see the body as sacred. He saw it as a casing, a husk that needed to be emptied before it could be filled with anything holy. His doctrine, written in margins of hymnal books and scratched into the backs of chapel icons, was never preached from the pulpit but was carved into practice with cruel precision. He called it the doctrine of the hollow flesh, a belief that sin was not just a spiritual burden but a physical residue layered into nerves and marrow from birth. The younger the child, the more pliable the vessel. The more easily sin could be purged through carefully administered pain. It wasn't punishment, he wrote, it was refined. Suffering was the tool, not the consequence. He quoted scripture next to sketches of nerve clusters, pairing gospel verses with anatomical charts that he modified to show which areas of the body resisted grace and which opened the fastest when pricked, twisted, or silenced. It was not torture to him, it was spiritual surgery. In the vestry cabinet among the chalices and incense, they later found a rolled parchment labeled Order of Extraction. It laid out a ritual that began with fasting, followed by 3 stages: severance of voice, dulling of breath, and bleeding of sensation. Each stage had its own hymn, which the other boys were forced to sing as background, creating what he called a choir of consent. Alphonse believed that each note sung during suffering tuned the flesh, that pain could produce harmony if applied with timing and care. He claimed that a child free of sin would not scream, and that those who did were simply revealing how much rot still lived inside them. One boy endured all 3 stages and was later paraded in front of the altar, silent, trembling but alive. Alphonse declared him a vessel, a shell that could now be used by God as he saw fit. But that boy vanished weeks later, his bed found soaked with a blackish fluid no doctor could identify. Alphonse dismissed it as divine overflow. The parish ledger logged which children had undergone partial or full hollowing and which were deemed too fractured to continue. Those were often listed as returned to dust. Their names were struck through with a red line drawn from left to right, always the same hand, always the same angle. He taught the choir that their flesh was never theirs to begin with and that pain wasn't to be feared but embraced because it pulled out what words could not. Most believed him, or at least pretended to. The only thing worse than being hollowed was being labeled unsalvageable. For those, the process was never repeated. There was no ceremony, no second chance, only silence, the final proof in his twisted theology that they had always been empty. When the boards beneath the vestry finally gave way, the men expected mold or rats or perhaps forgotten relics from a century ago, but what they found was colder than rot and quieter than dust. A shallow pit, deliberately carved, lined with linen that had hardened into something like parchment, held a stack of books too thick to be Bibles and too crude to be journals. There were 11 in total, each wrapped in oiled cloth, each heavy with a moisture that shouldn't have survived the years. The bindings were not stitched with thread. They were laced with fine wire, almost surgical in precision, holding together pages that curled at the corners and bore pores. Human pores. These books were not made of paper. They had been written on skin. Stretched, flayed, dried, and pressed into sheets, each page bore hymns written in a liquid that clotted at the edges and darkened into rust-colored trails. Testing would confirm it as human blood, and though the origin remained unnamed, the matching of DNA fragments to remains found beneath the choir loft offered one answer too many. These were not sacred texts. These were records of pain. Each hymn was numbered, titled, and measured in units unfamiliar to the musical eye. Not by bars or tempo, but by seconds of anticipated silence. One entry, labeled Canticle of the Sieve, began with a note held for 8 full seconds, followed by a blank space and then a series of rising tones. In the margins, handwritten notations marked times with chilling clarity: 3 secs or sob, 6 secs or tremor, 9 secs or rupture. They were not composing songs. They were recording thresholds. The exact moment a body broke, the instant silence turned to scream. These were maps of agony masquerading as music, and they were organized, catalogued, revered. One book held a small pressed flower between its pages, a blackened stem of nightshade, with the note, "He sang past the limit. Reward, release." No one could determine who wrote the annotations, but the script matched the margins of the church ledger, and the ink bore the same copper trace as dried blood mixed with wine. The pages were warped by heat in places, suggesting they had once been near a flame but were never meant to burn. Preserved, not destroyed. The ink blots weren't accidental. They were smeared deliberately, forming almost invisible symbols beneath the notes. Some believed they were sigils. Others said that they were remnants of a language built from pain itself, one only the hollowed could understand. As the townspeople gathered outside the church to witness the books being carried out under sheets, a strange hush came over them. The wind dropped, the trees stood still, and someone swore they heard a faint harmony rise from beneath the boards, not in joy or mourning, but in warning. The kind of sound no choir should ever make. The kind of song that never needed a voice to be heard. His name was never recorded in the baptismal logs, only mentioned once in the choir ledger as the bell puller, mute, cooperative. He was small for his age, maybe 7, maybe 10, with ash blonde hair and a scar under his chin shaped like a question mark. No one remembered when he arrived in Gilead. He simply became part of the background, The boy with rope-burnt palms who rang the bells precisely at sunrise, at mass, and at nightfall, even when there was no congregation to hear them. Father Alphonse kept him close, not as a child to be guided, but as a tool to be used. The boy never spoke a word. Some said he had no tongue, others that he'd swallowed it in fear. But what he lacked in voice, he left behind in pages, dozens of them hidden beneath a broken floor tile in what used to be his sleeping chamber behind the chapel's rear wall. Found rolled tightly into a rusted tin months after the tower collapsed, the pages were not filled with words, but with drawings, crude, obsessive, and deeply wrong. Each sheet was done in charcoal and animal blood, lines overlapping like tangled thoughts. The first showed the church from above, the bell tower looming with black shapes descending into its mouth like falling crows. Another showed the choir, boys standing in perfect rows with stitched smiles, while behind them loomed figures in robes that had no faces, just hollow ovals where eyes should be. In many of the sketches the priests smiled, always smiling, but the children wept. Their tears were drawn as straight lines, some dripping onto staffs of music, others ending in sharp hooks. One recurring image was the bell itself, not as an object, but as a god, towering, its mouth wide open, and from its center hung not a clapper but a child, head tilted back as if mid-scream. The boy seemed to understand something no one else had ever dared document, that the bells were not instruments of celebration or mourning, but of sacrifice. Among the most disturbing images was a drawing of the altar, but instead of candles and scripture it showed a constellation etched above it. 19 stars in a spiral, each marked with a number, each connected by jagged lines. No one recognized the pattern. It wasn't astrological, it wasn't a musical, it was something else entirely. Something encoded. One investigator theorized it matched the pattern of cracks in the tower's foundation. Another claimed it mapped the order of choir boys who disappeared, but none could prove it. Even modern analysis failed to find a matching symbol set in any known religious or scientific texts. Beneath the drawing was a single line written in crooked script. They ring it to feed it. They ring it when one is full. Some believed the mute boy had witnessed more than he could ever say. That the ringing wasn't just for ritual but for alert, a signal sent into something buried below. His last drawing, folded separately, was different from the rest, simpler. It showed only one figure, a small child standing alone in the church, staring up at the bell with empty eyes. Above the bell were no ropes, no hands, no priests, only stars, 19 of them in the same spiral. But this time one had been blackened out. It was labeled with a single initial, his own. He had drawn his own end before it arrived, mapped it in silence, and left it hidden beneath the place where he slept. As if he knew that one day the tower would fall, the truth would surface, and someone, anyone, would finally hear what he had been ringing for all along. In the catacombs beneath the crumbled church, past the shattered crypt doors and beneath the wet stone where roots had begun to crawl like veins, the floor was stained with a waxy sheen that resisted even boiling water. It coated the corners of the chamber like frozen honey and clung to the ribs of the old stone altar, hardened but untouched by time. Investigators at first assumed it was remnants of age-old candle drippings, the kind used in funerary rites or midnight masses. But when samples were taken and tested, the composition told a different story. This was no beeswax, no paraffin. The formula included rendered animal fat, fragments of a resin found only in burial grounds, and a powder derived from white oleander, a toxin in small doses, a death sentence in large ones. Most disturbing was the melting point. The candles had been engineered to burn cold. Low heat, slow melt, but endless hours of flame. They were not designed for light. They were designed for endurance. Someone had wanted suffering to last. In the center of the chamber were 7 iron pillars, rusted at the base but otherwise still intact. Metal loops at the top suggested restraints. Under each pillar, discolorations marred the stone in human shape, like shadows left by heat. Near one of them, half buried in soot, was a branding rod with a circle at the end, its tip barbed to press into flesh and hold. The symbol it bore was exact, a ring with no break, stitched shut at one point like a wound that refused to close. It matched a mark found again and again, on corpses in shallow graves behind the choir walls, on jawbones unearthed near the foundation, and most eerily on the tongues of the dead. Some tongues had been cut clean, others left inside the jaw, but all bore the same seal burnt into the muscle with care. Not once had it slipped. The circle was always centered, always measured, always permanent. This was not punishment, it was a ritual. Father Alphonse's doctrine described the tongue as the first betrayer, the organ that sinned before the mind had time to repent. He taught that the voice could lead to corruption and that silence was the only true act of holiness. But silence, he believed, had to be earned, not through choice but through pain, through branding, through purification. The candles were made to keep the child awake, to burn slowly enough that the heat never triggered unconsciousness, and to prolong the moment when iron met flesh. Screams were expected, they were timed to the hymns. Witnesses later recalled that the branding ceremonies were masked as lessons in discipline. The choir would hum in minor keys while the iron was heated and pressed, the flame just close enough to keep the child alert, just far enough not to kill. A few managed to survive, marked but still breathing. Those were elevated in status, called the sealed, but most didn't survive. Their bodies were buried without markers, but their tongues were preserved, stored in oil, catalogued and numbered. One jar was recovered from beneath the altar. It contained 3 small tongues floating in amber fluid, each with the circle burnt into the tip. Beneath the jar was a paper note that read, "These ones resisted longest. Pray for them." The ink was the same as the hymnal annotations, the same as the skin books. The same hand had written it all. And somewhere in the catacombs, when the wind moved just right through the broken walls, investigators claimed they could still smell the wax, not burning but waiting, a faint trace of oleander and iron lingering in the dark like a ritual never fully ended. In the lowest chamber of the crypt, beneath layers of stone sealed by time and silence, they found what came to be known only as the confessor's throne. It was not a chair in the ordinary sense, but a device. Part altar, part restraint, part machine. Constructed from black iron welded into a human shape, its spine high and curved, its arms lined with clamps disguised as rests. Dust coated its surface like ash from an unspoken fire, but beneath that layer the structure remained intact. The seat itself was scorched and stained, and the leather straps that once held wrists and ankles had rotted into threads. But the wiring, twisted copper veins coiled beneath the arms, behind the headrest and into the floor, was still there, still pulsing faintly with static when touched. It was the oldest known use of galvanic stimulation found outside a medical setting, but this was no act of healing. The throne was wired for pain, not revival, designed not to save a life, but to pull a dying voice back from the edge, just long enough to speak or scream. Behind the throne was a shelf mounted to the wall upon which rested 3 jars filled with blackened fluid, each containing what remained of tongues. Some whole, some split, all marked with the same scorched circle. Above them was a plaque carved in Latin, its inscription translated later as, "Let the silence be lifted before the soul departs." This was the doctrine taken to its final form. Father Alphonse believed that no death was complete unless accompanied by confession. But his version of confession was not given freely. It was extracted, pulled from the body like poison through a wound. And when a child lost consciousness too soon, he used this machine to bring them back. Witnesses from that era later described moments during services when faint burning smells rose from the floorboards, even though no candles were lit and no incense burnt. They were told it was the holy scent of cleansing. But now, with the throne uncovered, the truth was harder to deny. The smoke had not risen from flame, it had risen from flesh. The wiring had been spliced dozens of times. One cable, wrapped crudely in linen, led directly into the armrest, where investigators found a corroded prong still embedded with a fragment of jawbone, tooth still intact. The flesh around it had long decayed, but the bone bore scorch marks consistent with electrical burns. This child had not only been restrained, they had been reawakened through pain, pulled back into awareness to speak words they never chose. A journal found nearby, bound in softened bark and sealed with a wax imprint of the stitched circle, contained notations in Alphonse's hand. Subject 12. Silence held beyond expectation. Required double current to evoke penance. Another entry read, Subject 8 returned with clarity, confessed unnatural thoughts, and terminated post-chant. These were not confessions in the name of forgiveness. They were trophies, proof of control. In one corner of the room, near where the wiring vanished into the stone, there was a small wooden box sealed with 7 nails. Inside was a tangle of dried wires and 5 tiny glass tubes filled with brown residue, each labeled with initials. It became clear this was a reserve supply, as if the machine was never meant to stop, as if it had been used again and again, until there was no one left to confess. And even now, when the investigators left the crypt and sealed it behind them, they reported one last sound echoing through the walls. Not the crackle of wire or the scrape of metal, but a single intake of breath, too faint to be real but too clear to ignore, as though something deep below had just been reminded it still had a voice. By the first frost of winter in 1845, the once haunting hymns of St. Erasmus Parish had fallen silent. For 7 years, the choir had sung with eerie perfection, each note lifted into the rafters with neither hesitation nor human warmth. Then, all at once, the sound was gone. At first, the townspeople believed it was an illness. A brutal fever had been whispered about in nearby counties, and Father Alphonse himself stood at the pulpit that Sunday and said the boys were being kept in isolation for their protection. He asked for patience, for prayer, and for silence, always silence, but the church doors remained locked. No bells rang, no candles burnt, no footsteps echoed through the nave. And then snow came, heavy, relentless. The town, already used to quiet, adjusted to the absence with uneasy grace. But something beneath the surface had begun to rot. It wasn't until spring thaw that the truth surfaced. Not by confession, but by scent. Workers clearing the southern wall of the rectory noticed a faint, sour odor rising through the floorboards, as if the earth itself had turned. They followed it to a trap door near the eastern stairwell, nailed shut with rusted iron spikes and painted over in layers of dust. When it was pried open, the first wave of air was so foul it made one man collapse. Below, in the basement chamber, they found 17 caskets, all identical, all sealed. Each one was stamped not with names but with single initials carved into the lid, followed by a musical note, A, Sion, D, F, E flat, as if their names had been reduced to tones. There were no flowers, no crosses, no final rites. Only wood, rot, and silence. The official report filed by Alphonse claimed spiritual rebellion. The phrasing was vague, almost poetic. He wrote that certain members of the choir had turned inward, rejecting discipline and disrupting the harmony of divine purpose. He called it a rupture of intent, a collapse of sacred order. No disease was mentioned. No physician had been summoned. The term spiritual rebellion appeared 5 times in the report, each underlined as if repetition might mask the absence of reason. One town clerk years later found a torn page wedged inside the parish record book, its ink smeared with what looked like blood. The writing was frantic, half-cursive, and nearly illegible, but one line stood clear. They sang the wrong hymn. Not out loud, but inside. He could hear it. Post-mortem examination, carried out decades later when the site was reopened, revealed the cause of death was not illness. Each body bore signs of chemical exposure to a sedative not documented until years after their deaths. Their mouths were sewn shut. Their tongues were removed. Some bore burns on their chests in the shape of a small circular brand, and in the lining of each casket was a hymnal page folded and stitched into the fabric, always the same page. A single verse. "Let the body lie quiet, for the voice has sinned." It became clear that the silence had not been chosen. It had been enforced. No explanation was ever given. The church was closed within a year, cited for structural instability. Father Alphonse was never seen again. Some said he left for a monastery in the mountains. Others whispered that he'd been buried beneath the choir pit, sealed behind the wall he built. But no grave was ever found. Only the sealed caskets, the initials carved in cold wood, and the knowledge that 17 boys were silenced not by God, not by nature, but by doctrine twisted into death. The spring storm of 1846 was remembered by the town of Gilead not for its violence, but for what it revealed. The sky that night had not churned with rage, but moved with eerie rhythm. Lightning flashing at regular intervals, thunder rolling like footsteps in a procession. The rain fell soft and steady, not in chaos, but in timing. It was as if the storm had been summoned, and in a way, it had. In the weeks leading up to Easter, Father Alphonse had spoken often of cleansing. Not the kind preached from the altar, but the kind whispered in the margins of journals carved into stone, hidden behind hymns. He had grown quieter, thinner, and more devout. He fasted through Lent until his cheeks hollowed and claimed his dreams were filled with instructions from voices older than Scripture. One surviving diary, later found beneath a false wall in the rectory, recorded his final doctrine: that sin, when buried too deep, rotted not just the soul but the land above it, and only destruction, planned, deliberate, sacred, could erase what time would not forgive. He had chosen the tower carefully. It was the highest point in Gilead, the only place where sound echoed for miles. Beneath it lay the sealed chamber, the confessor's throne, the branded dead, the hollowed and tongueless and broken. He believed their sins had not been silenced, only buried, and that they still hummed beneath the stone, poisoning the altar with spiritual rot. So he made a plan. In a locked storeroom behind the sanctuary, he stored barrels of saltpeter harvested from within the hills, not for preservation, but for ignition. Mixed with crushed charcoal and sulfur, he created a crude but volatile powder. He applied it to the base supports of the bell tower, not in haste, but with surgical precision, lining the interior beams with thin veins of the compound, embedding it where it would not be seen. He wanted the collapse to appear divine, a message from above. But the damage would come from below. His diary noted that Easter would be the moment of rebirth, that the fall of the tower would scatter the past like ash and allow new order to rise. He wrote of wiping clean the throat of the church, as though the tower itself had spoken sins too long ignored. But he misjudged the materials, or perhaps the weight of the guilt he had layered into the walls. The storm came early, 3 days before Easter, and with it came a pressure shift that none could explain. The air grew thick and metallic as if the heavens were inhaling deeply. The lightning struck the weather vane atop the tower. The beam it touched was one of the supports he had altered. The ignition was not loud. It was low, like a sigh from beneath the earth. Then came the collapse. Stones dropped straight down, not outward. The bells fell last. They rang once, then again, then stopped. When the dust cleared, Alphonse was gone. Some claimed he was beneath the rubble. Others insisted he had fled the instant the tower groaned, but his body was never found. What was found days later was a single parchment nailed to the back of the pulpit, sealed with wax shaped in the stitched circle. His symbol for silence. The message read only, "The throat has closed. Let no voice rise that has not first been emptied." No one ever claimed responsibility for the collapse. The town declared it a tragic structural failure worsened by weather. But those who had seen the way the beams had burnt from the inside knew otherwise. What the storm revealed was not just a crumbling building, but a design. The powder had been placed in patterns, precise, almost ritualistic. As if the fall had been choreographed to mimic a kneeling figure, the steeple folded down like a bowed head. In the weeks that followed, no one could explain the way animals avoided the church grounds. Birds flew around it, dogs barked toward it and backed away. And at night, those who lived near the ruin swore they still heard the tower groan, not in protest, but in prayer. The kind of prayer whispered through teeth, offered not to heaven, but to something waiting in the dirt beneath. They began digging 2 weeks after the collapse, when the ground had finally dried enough for the wreckage to be cleared without risking further cave-ins. Most expected to find shattered stone, broken beams, and the usual ruins of a building brought down by time or miscalculation. But the excavation team quickly learnt that the wreckage did not behave like a natural collapse. The debris had not fallen outward in chaos. It had compacted inward like something had drawn the tower down into itself. At the center of the impact crater, just beneath what used to be the belfry, they uncovered a soft patch of earth that hadn't been disturbed by weight or weather. Beneath that, they found the first remains, not lying in rest, not buried, arranged. Kneeling in a half-circle formation, each skeleton is positioned with its spine arched, head tilted back, and mouth open. But these mouths had not been left that way by chance. Each jaw had been pried wide and held there with lengths of copper wire looped through the bone, twisting around the molars, forcing them agape, as if they had been silenced not in life, but commanded to keep singing in death. The bones were fragile but clean. No signs of recent trauma, no clothing, no burial wrappings. Only the unnatural way their fingers curled inward, not like bodies at rest, but like they had once gripped something tightly. Perhaps a hymnal. Perhaps each other. In one of the skeletal hands, they found a small shard of blackened wax. The residue matched the same cold burning formula uncovered in the catacombs. The implication was clear. These bodies had not died in the collapse. They had been placed long before, sealed beneath the sanctuary floor, locked in poses that echoed the final act of a forgotten choir. Someone, likely Alphonse, had preserved them like instruments stored between performances. But what disturbed the investigators most wasn't the positioning, it was the skull. One of the remains, likely that of an older boy based on bone structure and height, had been marked. Not tattooed or branded, but carved. A series of deliberate incisions along the dome of the skull, etched so finely into the bone that they had remained clear even through decades of decay. It took hours to decipher, but the words written in Latin were eventually translated, "Ut vox mea remaneat," so that my voice remains. The sentence wrapped around the crown like a halo of pain, ending just above the teeth where a final symbol was etched. The stitched circle again, this time enclosed within a pair of wings. Whether this was meant as reverence or mockery, no one could say. But the message was undeniable. Someone had turned this child into a permanent echo, a vessel not just of silence but of unending voice, held open by wire, sanctified by the absence of breath. Further beneath, in a lower channel once mistaken for a drainage trench, they found more remains. Fragments this time, some no larger than a coin. Vertebrae, finger bones, portions of ribs. All of them were scorched, burnt not by fire but by steady low heat, like they had been near those cold burning candles for days without death claiming them quickly. Some still bore markings, faint scratches that, when connected, formed half-phrases from hymns never published. It was as though the music had been etched into them, each body reduced to a note, a beat, a pause. And through it all, in the silence of the dig site, workers reported an impossible sound. A soft hum, low and breathless, vibrating through the stone. No source could be found. It stopped when they stepped away. It returned when they returned. By the end of the third week, 23 skeletons had been recovered, though records accounted for only 22 boys ever brought into the parish. One skull was larger than the rest, the jaw fused shut with iron. A test confirmed what many feared. The bone density and shape did not match a child's. It matched a man. Possibly late 30s, possibly Alphonse. If true, it meant he had sealed himself down there, beneath the very structure he later destroyed, wiring his own mouth closed to ensure silence in both directions. But the question remained. Who carved the Latin prayer? If his hands were bound, who made sure the words remained? The excavation was ordered to stop after that, the site declared too unstable to proceed. A layer of concrete was poured over the ruin, and a plaque erected years later called it a site of historical reverence. But the locals never returned. The ground remained dry even in storms, grass refused to grow, and those who stood near the old perimeter at night swore they heard breathing from below. Not frantic or mournful, but steady, rhythmic, as if something still waited beneath the rubble, mouth held wide by copper wire, humming a note no one living could name. The land where St. Erasmus once stood is quiet now. The stone has long been cleared, the pit filled and sealed beneath layers of earth, gravel, and concrete. A wrought iron fence surrounds the perimeter, overgrown with vines that never bloom. No plaque names the dead, no cross marks the center. But every year, without fail, on the third night of April, someone hears the bells. Not the clang of steel or the sharp strike of iron, but a sound low and hollow, like breath blown through metal from beneath the dirt. It starts just after midnight and fades before dawn. Those who live near the edge of town say it never rings in patterns, only pulses. Long, drawn notes that carry no melody. And yet something about the rhythm unsettles them, as if the silence between the sounds is where the real message lies. For a long time, no one investigated. The town had buried more than rubble. They had buried memories. But in 1851, a new historical commission funded by the state began reviewing parish records from across Missouri. Their task was simple: catalog early religious institutions for preservation. What they found instead was a thread, a single letter from 1837 written by a seminary official in St. Louis, thanking Father Alphonse for accepting our most willful wards and promising additional candidates in accordance with your criteria. Another note followed in early 1839 referencing the new shipment arriving by rail, 11 total, 2 nonverbal. The commission searched further and found gaps in orphanage records statewide. Children labeled unfit for adoption, too quiet or too resistant, marked as transferred but with no destination listed. The trail led to Gilead again and again. The choir, once praised for its otherworldly harmony, had been built not from selection but from rejection. These were the forgotten, the discarded, passed along like burdens until someone found a use for their silence. It was enough to trigger a formal inquiry. Survivors were tracked down. Elias Hartwell, then near his deathbed, gave testimony. He spoke of the boy with the blue rope, the mouth held open with wire and the branding candles that never gave off heat. His memories were fractured, drifting between scripture and screams, but the details matched the records. And then came the drawings. Pages retrieved from the mute bell puller's tin canister, preserved by a descendant who had never opened them. A team of historians analyzed the constellation drawn over the altar, mapping it to locations of every confirmed seminary shipment over a decade. The stars weren't stars. They were children. Each point is a body, each line a silence strung between institutions that swore they had done nothing wrong. In 1852, the Missouri Silent Orphan Reform Act passed with little resistance. It banned closed transfers between religious orphanages. It mandated third-party oversight of all boarding facilities. And most importantly, it forced institutions to account for every child. Not as a number, not as a burden, but as a name with a voice, a legacy. But legislation could not wash the stain from Gilead. The land was never repurposed. No school, no home, and no church were ever built atop the ruins. The soil resisted, foundations cracked, survey poles leaned at odd angles no matter how they were braced. People stopped trying. Still the question lingered, how could such evil exist for so long, so close without anyone speaking up? The answer was never fire, never rage, never chaos. It was an order, discipline. The kind of control that dresses itself in white robes, speaks softly about virtue, and binds its victims in silence so convincingly that even the screams sound like prayer. Father Alphonse never ran. He never raved. He wrote scripture in blood not to shock but to structure, to organize suffering into ritual. That is how it spreads. Not through violence, but through doctrine. Through people too frightened to question and too willing to believe that anything done in God's name must be good. And so the bells still ring, not by wind or weight or metal, but by memory. Passed down through marrow and silence, echoing through foundations that were never meant to hold truth. You won't find their names on headstones. You won't find photographs or holy relics. But you will find the hum if you stand still long enough. The low vibration that rises from the soil on April's third night, like a question asked by the earth itself. One, it keeps asking year after year. What do you think? How many towers must fall before we question who built them?